So Julia and I talked with a few environmental groups in the Quad City area just to kind of figure out what they do and how they differ and how they're the same. We spoke with 2 people from Living Lands and Waters, and then one from, what was the organization that she...
It was from River Action, and it was Kathy Wine.
Okay. So the first person we talked to was, I think her name was Samantha.
Samantha Eager.
Yes,
Samantha Eager.
We talked to Samantha from Living Lands and Waters, and she actually filled out our questionnaire over email. So she gave us some really good concrete information about the program as a whole.
So one of the first questions that we asked was just that, can you give us an introduction onto the kind of specific type of tradition or activism that you had found yourself in? Like, we're an environmental organization, and our mission is to aid the protection, preservation, and restoration of the natural environment and the nation's major rivers and their watersheds. So really this one actually just focuses on the Mississippi River in and of itself. Yeah, and then they also kind of answered, like, what specific event or tragedy had happened that made you become interested in saving the environment. And so Chad actually grew up around the Mississippi River, and he had started calling and making appearances at government agencies, and then he found out that no one else was going to actually clean up the river, so he decided that he would. And then in 1998, when he was 23, he actually founded the Living Lands and Waters. So, I mean, that really just kind of goes to show that anybody who has a dream can really do anything.
We also asked them if the community had been positive or negative in general toward the movement, and they said that they get a huge support from the community pretty unanimously because it's just a common sense thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Mike touched on that in my interview with him a lot, so.
And then again, we just kind of asked, like, if there were any thinking processes that were damaging, and one of the things that she had said was that we really just want to be positive and have the belief system that everyone can do anything, even if it is something small at first. And then she also mentioned that we focus more on social change as opposed to political change. So they try to make their events fun as possible so that their volunteers are engaged and want to come back again, which I really think is important, that you start social first and really kind of awaken the people in their education, and then you can move on to political activism later on. This was kind of an interesting question. When they're talking about the environment, and we talked about ecofeminism, so really implying feminine or masculine qualities to the environment.
Question, actually. Every single question I asked over the phone, he really tried to give a good answer to it. He said for that one that what I had asked him was, do you think, we talked a little bit about ecofeminism in class and how some people believe that the earth should be talked about as female and thought about as female. And I said that some people think that this is kind of just flipping the coin the other way, where it makes males, A, uninterested in the environment, B, it seem like women's work, or, you know, a tree hugger thing. And he said, actually, we try to be really inclusive. And for them, what they do is, you know, they clear the garbage out of the river. It typically seems like male work, you know, go out on my boat, pick up the garbage, you know. He said, but they're really good at trying to be inclusive and selling it in a different way. So I guess that it was something that he hadn't really thought about much before, but it really does tie into their general philosophy. So I was really glad he answered that question.
Right, so maybe kind of when you're thinking about it, you can, but I mean, in your day-to-day activism, it's not something that's kind of like an overlying theme.
But it really does have to do with how many people you're able to get involved, because it's so easy to cut people off, especially when it comes to ecology and that kind of stigma about being a tree hugger, you know, and this and that.
Yeah, so I mean, we also asked Samantha if there was anything that she would like to say that really hasn't, like if somebody hasn't heard her message before, so if she just got to talk to somebody. And she really says that environmental stewardship is everyone's responsibility, whether it's something as simple as shutting off the water when you brush your teeth in the morning or rolling up your sleeves to join us on the riverbank. She offers many different types of activism that you can do, and I mean, they go from the Million Trees Project, which is what most of us did for Lasso, or the Adopt a River Mile program, which I think you guys had talked about in your blog, Maura. So I really think that it's important just to kind of have all of these different options so that if you don't find the one that you like, there is something else.
We also asked both, or all of our interviewees, if they had hope in achieving an overall goal, or even in just like people waking up. And this, Samantha gave us a really surprising fact that they had pulled over 8.5 million pounds of garbage from the Mississippi River, and they just keep doing it. So in a way, that's good. In a way, it just really wakes you up to how much waste there is out there. And Mike was pretty hopeful too. So.
Yeah, and likewise, Kathy was as well from River Action. Yeah, she just says that they really don't lose hope at all, and that even throughout the Quad Cities, there's lots of ways to get connected. So even if they're not doing it specifically with River Action, as long as they're doing something. Like, she gave me a funny story, or not, I guess, a funny story, but there's been times where they'll spread out a message or like a press release, and it'll get credited to something else, and she'll be like, we'll let that other organization take credit for it as long as it's actually being helpful to the environment. So they don't even care if they're given credit as long as it's doing something good, which I thought was really awesome.
And that was the attitude that Mike really seemed to have. He was like, oh, you want to talk to me? Like, he will, any of these people from Living Lands and Waters especially, like, they were just so welcoming. And I guarantee that if you decide to go out and help them and you're, like, nervous about getting into volunteering, I guarantee you they will just hand you a shovel and say, jump in. I mean, they seem to be really, really inclusive. Talk a little bit more in depth about my interview with Mike over the phone. I asked him basically the same set of questions that we asked Samantha and Kathy, and asked him a little bit about his personal involvement as well. I just asked him, what do you guys do? And he said, we just really want to create awareness. They don't do lobbying, he says, although, you know, lobbying is great and stuff, but they really want to just focus on reaching out to people and reconnect people, especially to the river, because the river is kind of the hub of our community. He says, this is what I really love about this organization, is that it brings all backgrounds into it. Like Chad, who is the guy who founded it, he says, I'm just a guy like out here cleaning up the river. And I think that's what really appeals to people about Living Lands and Waters, because it's just no matter where you're from or what you do, you can take like an hour or two out of your day to go and help them do something nice. Then I asked Mike, you know, how did you get into this, and what point in your life did you decide you wanted to do this? And he said, he surprised me by saying that he'd always been involved in it. I guess I kind of figured people just had an awakening and went and decided they were going to do this, but he said his mother was very passionate about the environment, and his father actually had like a litter patrol where they would go out and pick up garbage as he was a kid, so like this is something he's been doing since he was very small. And he said, you know, I went fishing with my dad and everything, and I said, you know, this is really, at which point I kind of interrupted him and I said, you know, I think that this is an ideal spot to have this kind of program in the Quad Cities, because we're in a place where, you know, like I said, the river is the focus of our environment, and then you don't really have to go very far to be in the middle of farms or forests or whatever. And he said, you know, that it really helps us. He says we take high school students out onto the river, and we have like a photo contest where we have them just take pictures of things that they wouldn't normally notice, and kind of open their eyes to like what is actually around them, which is really neat. He said, I asked him about, you know, whether the community had been positive or negative, and he said, you know, every once in a while you get a couple dissenters and stuff, but he said, overall, it's just common sense. Like, no one is going to argue that garbage shouldn't be in the river. Like, he said, you know, no one's going to argue about that. Another thing I asked him about was if you want to get involved. Right now they're doing an invasive species removal, and that's actually, they're removing honeysuckle. It's taking over, so there's info on the website about that if you want to get involved. And also, there's another interesting program where they do an alternative spring break. You can go and do a different thing with them every day for a week, or however many days you have, or how many hours you have, and really you'll get to see what they do through that, and it's a great way to help out.
What I thought was really interesting is that Kathy actually kind of had an awakening moment to kind of take care of the river. So when she actually moved here, she was in a duplex, and that had a kind of a riverfront property, so she could actually see the river, and she always thought it was like a beautiful anemone and wanted others to see it, but very few people could actually go and see it. So she really kind of wanted to make it so that everyone could see it, and yeah, so she really got active and became an advocate later on, so that was really awesome. There was actually a building that got demolished, the Robin Flour Mill Company, and that once that got demolished, she really became active. I also thought it was kind of interesting too that she had made a really big point about connecting people to the river, so that once they decide to become a volunteer and they really want to become active and actually have that connection to the river, then they don't lose it, and so they forever want to become a volunteer, be active, and lower on their waste and everything like that. She also said that when I asked her about, is there anything that she would really like to see done that really isn't done, kind of like about the community being active, and she said that leadership is different. You really want to be respected for being respected and not being liked, and I really thought that that was important for talking about environmentalism, because you do kind of have to have a respect for the environment and not really treat it as just an unlimited resource. When I kind of asked her about ways the community has been positive or negative and what kind of beliefs kind of went against her, she really thought that you kind of have to be active, and that educating citizens was kind of one of the big ways to do that. So again, like Mike said, they're not lobbying, they're doing projects, they're actually focusing on being protective of the environment rather than doing policy. And she also says that policy comes with being informed, so really just kind of focusing on the social aspects of environmentalism before focusing on policy, which I think that if we were to all kind of focus in on a small scale, then that could definitely be for better.
It's like Dr. Malachuk was just saying, affection comes first before morality. Affection informs morality.
Right, definitely, exactly. And then that also kind of gets tied into the echo maker. I mean, even with the cranes too, how just finding out about them and seeing them can really just kind of, that feeling really puts it into perspective on what we actually need to do. So yeah, Kathy was also very helpful. There's no reason for her to lose hope at all. So maybe if it's not even the river or some other catastrophe, she's very hopeful in what we can accomplish and what they're accomplishing there at River Action. Other than that, everybody loves clean drinking water, and so that was kind of one of the other thing too, that, I mean, there's reason for everybody to want to get involved. So, yeah.
Something that I thought was really interesting that you said was that she kind of became involved after she saw a building demolished.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of also goes into activism with the community and historical. I mean, that's even a whole other thing.
Right,
we could talk
yeah.
for an hour about that. So that's really interesting to me, because it's not really just caring about like the nature around you. It's about caring about what we've built together as well. Like it all ties in.